I only once in my life saw Dr. Sasse, and that was when he was teaching a graduate course at St. Louis when I was an undergraduate. So I didn't take the graduate course, but he gave a lecture for the whole seminary community on Luther and the ecumenical creeds. And if you go to the St. Louis Seminary website, they still have that there. I can't quite remember how you locate it. But Dr. Sasse's talk on Luther and the ecumenical creeds, you can actually hear him talking. And so let me just, Dr. Piepkorn, I knew. I knew him from the time I entered the St. Louis Seminary in 1963 until 3 days before his death on December the 13th, 1973. On December the 10th, he had seen me through the oral examination on my thesis, the Colloquia Mobiliar 1586. And 3 days later, I got the phone call that he had died. It was a shock. He was only 66 years old. Well, I first heard of Dr. Piepkorn when I was a high school kid across the street at City College High School. My cousin Elise's brother had been a student at the St. Louis Seminary and had become something of an admirer of Dr. Piepkorn. So the first book I ever got of Dr. Piepkorn's was one that was published by Concordia Publishing House in 1952. It's really sort of a booklet of about 41 pages. And the title is What the Symbolical Books of the Lutheran Church Have to Say About Worship and the Sacraments. So basically, what Piepkorn does, he takes all that the confessions say on this topic and he summarizes it in a series of theses, worship and then the sacraments and so on. So I got this book and I was thrilled with it. And then I heard about another book he had written, which was published in 1956. It was the first publication of the graduate school of Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, and a second edition was published in 1958. The title is The Survival of the Historic Vestments in the Lutheran Church after 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, when the adherents of the Augsburg Confession had an assured place in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. So this is a meticulous study of that down into the 20th century, up till about 1950. And I don't know of a book that is more comprehensive. The book became known in Germany, and a young student by the name of Jobst Schöne translated it into German. And of course, I'm sure most of you know that Jobst Schöne went on to be a pastor in our German sister church, and in due course, he became the bishop of our sister church and then the bishop emeritus. So Jobst Schöne made this available in German. Dr. Sasse first came to my attention in the year I graduated from high school, which was 1959. And as Dr. Stevenson pointed out, that was the year in which Sasse's book, This Is My Body, Luther's Contention for the Real Presence in the Sacrament of the Altar, was published by Augsburg Publishing House. And I can't think of a book that has had more of an influence on my own life and ministry and thinking than Dr. Sasse's book, This Is My Body. It is a It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, you must. You must. I think Concordia Publishing House still makes it available. Is that? I think yeah, it makes it available, and I can't recommend it too much. As I mentioned, I knew Dr. Piepkorn. I entered St. Louis Seminary in the fall of '63. And during the 10 years that I knew him, he was an influence not only in the classroom, but in so many other ways too. I was privileged to serve as one of his student assistants, checking out references and following up on things he wanted for the research he was doing. One summer, he had me check a work of one of his doctoral students, Father George Mastrantonis, who had made a translation of the correspondence between the Tübingen Lutheran theologians and the Patriarch of Constantinople in the 1580s. Father Mastrantonis, English was his second language, so what Father Piepkorn had me do was to try to make the English translation sound like English, and that was an interesting project. When I first got to St. Louis, every Wednesday evening, Dr. Piepkorn would celebrate the Holy Eucharist and preach at Luther Memorial in nearby Richmond Heights. When the St. Louis Seminary introduced the weekly Eucharist every Wednesday morning, Dr. Piepkorn continued to celebrate the Eucharist every Friday evening at Luther Memorial. And so I experienced him not only as a professor and mentor, but also as pastor and priest. And I can only say what I have often said, that when Dr. Piepkorn stood at the altar, you knew that here was a man who knew that he was standing in the presence of his Maker and his Redeemer. Because of last year's conference and Dr. Stevenson's presentation at this, most of us then are familiar with the outline of Dr. Sasse's life. But let me now give you a brief overview of Arthur Karl Piepkorn's life. Sasse was born in 1895, Piepkorn in 1907 in Milwaukee, and was graduated from Concordia, Milwaukee, before going on to St. Louis. Piepkorn's parents, I almost said presidents, tongue twister. Piepkorn's parents were members of the Wisconsin Synod in Milwaukee. But before he was born, they were excommunicated from the Wisconsin Synod parish they belonged to. And the reason was that they had been caught dancing on the eve of Pentecost. So they were excommunicated and they went to the Missouri Synod. So that's how Arthur Karl wound up in the Missouri Synod. We have any number of refugees from the Wisconsin Synod. I've known them for years. While at St. Louis, he was influenced by Walter Maier, the founding speaker of the Lutheran Hour, and Piepkorn enthusiastically supported the work of the Lutheran Hour. Walter Maier, of course, had a doctorate in Semitic studies from Harvard Divinity School, and Dr. Maier encouraged Piepkorn to pursue doctoral studies at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, which he did. Piepkorn's doctoral dissertation, which was published in 1933, I discovered just this last week, can still be found online at the University of Chicago website. And his dissertation was entitled Historical Prism Inscriptions of Ashurbanipal I, who was a 7th century BC Assyrian monarch. So Piepkorn's doctor, people think with his interest in in the liturgy and the chaplaincy and all that, and the confessions. But his academic degree was in Near Eastern studies. Piepkorn held several pastorates. He served first as F.R. Weber's assistant at St. Faith's Church in Cleveland, and then as Weber's successor. In 1936, he married Miriam Södergren, who was the daughter of a prominent pastor in the old Augustana Synod. That was the basically Swedish American Lutheran Synod. The marriage of Arthur Karl and Miriam was solemnized by Pastor Herbert Lindemann, who for many years was pastor of Redeemer Church in Fort Wayne, and the marriage was blessed with 4 daughters. Also in 1936, he entered the Army Chaplains Corps Reserve. He, in fact, served in that capacity throughout the Second World War, becoming the senior chaplain in Europe at the end of the war. And after that, he became commandant of the chaplain school at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Then, after that, he became the president of the Army Chaplain Board, and he was stationed at Fort Meade, which, you know, is just a bit south of here. And it was toward the very end of his tenure as president of the Chaplain Board that the then pastor of our Saviour, Pastor Stiemke, invited Piepkorn to come and be the officiant at the service at which the windows in the chancel were dedicated, the windows which are dedicated to the Creed and the Te Deum. So Dr. Piepkorn was the officiant. So there's a direct connection between this church we worshiped in this morning and Arthur Karl. Just as it was F.R. Weber who, when our Savior decided to build a church, the first thing Pastor Stiemke did was to have F.R. Weber come and explain to the congregation how you go about this. So F.R. Weber had a direct hand. He viewed this church building as an ideal building. His small church book and so forth, things that Pastor Coates told us about, are evidence of that. So in 1951, he was called to the St. Louis Seminary. Until his death in 1973. He taught there while still remaining active in the reserve chaplaincy until his retirement from the Army in 1967. Pastor John Hanna, a retired pastor of our synod and one of many men who entered the military chaplaincy because of Dr. Piepkorn's influence, recently published a book, Arthur Karl Piepkorn, Chaplain to the Greatest Generation, which chronicles Dr. Piepkorn's distinguished military career, rising to the rank of colonel. Piepkorn is buried at the Jefferson Barracks Seminary, not far from St. Louis. At his burial, following the solemn funeral Eucharist at the St. Louis Seminary Chapel, he received full military honors. The then chief of chaplains, General Gerhard Hyatt, who in retirement became a vice president of Synod, was the officiant at his burial, which I attended, both the funeral, Eucharist, and the burial. Okay. In the Festschrift, these Festschrifts seem to keep coming up in this conference. In the Festschrift published by the Fort Wayne Seminary for the 65th birthday of Roger Patelko, Roger was a student of Dr. Piepkorn. He was for a number of years bishop of the English district, and for a few years he was a vice president of Synod, and Roger was one of my dearest friends. In the Festschrift for Roger Patelko, Ronald Feuerhahn has a fascinating essay called Hermann Sasse's Critique of Arthur Karl Piepkorn. Critique of Arthur Karl Piepkorn. In this essay, we learn that Sasse and Piepkorn first met in 1948 at the home of another Hermann, Hermann Preuss, an uncle of Robert and Jack Preuss, who for many years taught at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. In an interview with Dr. Feuerhahn in 1987, Dr. Hermann Preuss described this first meeting of Sasse and Piepkorn, and he described it, Feuerhahn says, with some measure of awe. Hermann Preuss said, and I quote, "I had never witnessed such erudition, such command of the confessions, for instance, which both men continually cited in the original Latin and German." So that's when Sasse and Piepkorn first met. In 1951, now these next paragraphs are about the correspondence between Sasse and Hermann Preuss. In 1951, Sasse wrote to Hermann Preuss of his joy at Piepkorn's appointment to the St. Louis faculty. Quote, "Yesterday I read in the Una Sancta that Dr. Piepkorn has been called to a professorship in St. Louis. I am going to write him. I must tell him what great joy this news brought me. Eventually, he's found the real work of his life." He mentions reading in Una Sancta. Una Sancta was for a number of years sort of the journal of the liturgical movement in American Lutheranism. I have a few old copies of it here, including the copy in which there is an essay by both Piepkorn and Sasse, which I'll say a little more about in a few minutes. So anyway, now, that was in 1951. Just the year before, which is to say 1950, Sasse had written to Hermann Preuss in connection with Sasse's concern about developments at the St. Louis Seminary in the late 1940s. It would be impossible to go into detail about those concerns, but Dr. Stevenson has already pointed it out. And I think I can say this much, that Sasse's distress with the leadership of the St. Louis Seminary in the late 40s, men like Louis Seek, who was the president of the seminary, and Theodor Grebner, and of course that's a name you could go on for hours. He was for years on end the editor of Lutheran Witness. He was also a member of the St. James Society. He was an absolutely strict, uncompromising Missourian, but toward the end of his life, his views changed. And one of his essays was only published posthumously. It was too delicate to be published during his life. And the name of that essay is The Burden of Infallibility. The Burden of Infallibility. And in it, what Grebner addresses is the not uncommon view in the Missouri Synod that nothing but the infallible truth has been taught at every moment, at every time, in every place, schools, seminaries, churches, pulpits, lecterns, nothing but the infallible truth in the Missouri Synod. And Grebner's point is that this mindset makes it impossible to address problems as they should be addressed. But be all that as it may. So Sasse was concerned because Grebner had already gotten wobbly. And the heart of the thing was what Sasse was concerned about in connection with the St. Louis faculty in the late 40s was that they didn't seem to be able to grasp the seriousness of the state of confessional Lutheranism in Germany. They didn't understand how serious the formation of the evangelical church in Germany was. From the word go, Sasse saw that as essentially bringing all the Lutherans into the Prussian Union. And I think events have proven that Sasse was right. So he was very concerned about that. But at that time, and before Piepkorn went to seminary, Sasse says, I wonder what Dr. Piepkorn might think of these developments in the Missouri Synod. If he had been at the faculty of St. Louis, this is before he goes there, if he had been at the faculty of St. Louis, Piepkorn's sound historical thinking would have been a good counterweight against unhistoric dogmatism as well as unhistoric liberalism. But the Lutheran Church doesn't know how to make use of its scholars. Will you please give my regards to him? So that was in 1950. In 1951, Sasse writes to Hermann Preuss of his joy at the news that Piepkorn had in fact been appointed to the St. Louis faculty. But here we begin to detect some misgivings on the part of Dr. Sasse. 1 year later, in 1952, Sasse again writes to Hermann Preuss, I feel some concern about the co-workers of Dr. Piepkorn. And by co-workers, Sasse means not the members of the St. Louis faculty, but the people who served on the editorial board of Una Sancta and contributed articles to it. Already in 1948, an essay by Dr. Sasse, Liturgy and Lutheranism, had been published in Una Sancta, the translation done by Dr. Piepkorn himself. 4 years later, 1952, writes to Hermann Preuss, Piepkorn himself is a good Lutheran, but he is surrounded by some men whose understanding of the doctrinal side of the liturgy is very weak. You should help him discern the spirits. Otherwise, he will offer opportunities to the low church Protestants of the confessional Lutheran and the outlook. These people cannot distinguish between the usus sacramenti, which means the celebration as a whole, and the sumptio, the distinction between the use of the sacrament, which is the entire celebration, the sumptio is the oral participation. I assume we've all heard of the Confessional Lutheran magazine. It was, you might quickly say it was the forerunner of Christian News. Is that fair, Dr. Stevenson? The Confessional Lutheran. Yeah, it was a fiercely polemical work. Pastor Paul Bergdorf edited it. It was fiercely polemical. And in that journal, not only was Dr. Piepkorn criticized, but Pastor Runge of Zion Church in Detroit, he was abominated as a crypto-papist. So they were fierce. So the Confessional Lutheran, and then the magazine, The Lutheran Outlook, was a publication of the American Lutheran Conference, which is to say those synods that then were between the ULCA on one side and the Synodical Conference on the other. So much for the correspondence between Sasse and Hermann Preuss. Now I wish to say something about the correspondence between Sasse and Piepkorn. Sometime around 1955, Sasse wrote to Piepkorn asking him for help with the problem of, quote, one of his students, unquote, who was in danger of becoming a Roman Catholic. It seems that Piepkorn either did not receive or did not answer that letter. But on September the 30th, 1956, Sasse again wrote to Piepkorn explaining that the student was, in fact, his son Hans Christoph, And Hans Christoph did, in fact, wind up becoming a Roman Catholic. But in this letter of September 56, Sasse explains that he's not just writing about, quote, the cares and worries of a father, but that, quote, what caused me to write is an issue of the Confessional Lutheran, which was sent me these days from America, and in which you are mentioned. This letter to Piepkorn, it was no less than 8 typewritten pages, clearly shows Sasse's concern about the danger of liturgical movements, of high church movements. At the same time, in this letter, Sasse has this to say, and now I will quote this rather substantial part. Sasse explicitly speaks of, quote, the necessity of a liturgical movement within the Lutheran Church, which would help to revive the great Catholic heritage of our fathers, the liturgical life of the 16th and 17th centuries. It was this liturgy that prevented Lutheran orthodoxy from becoming a mere system or rational theology. We cannot revive the theology of our fathers without realizing what theology meant to them, praise of God and doctrine at the same time. One often has the impression that the correct doctrine of the sacraments is regarded as more important than their celebration. This is the danger for your church, meaning the Missouri Synod. This is the danger for your church. Though I must admit, having read wonderful sermons on the sacrament by your theologians, in which the full devotional content of the Orthodox liturgy found expression. Whatever the causes of the development in your church may have been, especially after the transition from German to English deprived so many of your pastors of a first-hand knowledge of the Lutheran Reformation, the great task remains for you, meaning the Synod, as for all Lutheran churches, to regain that lost unity of orthodoxy as pure doctrine and orthodoxy as right worship. It seems, however, that the same tragedy is taking place in America, which we observed in Germany when, between the two world wars, we had a rediscovery of the doctrine of the church on the one hand and liturgical movements on the other. Thus, the confessional church became unliturgical and therefore ineffective, while our liturgical movements became heretical or Romanistic. And then Sasse says this to Piepkorn: I think it is your task, dear Dr. Piepkorn, to prevent a similar tragedy in your church, meaning, of course, our synod. So as late as the fall of 1956, Sasse's attitude toward Piepkorn was still quite cordial. But by 1959, Sasse's attitude had changed. And it's very evident in his essay in the St. Luke the Evangelist issue of Una Sancta in 1916. So what happened? What happened? One part of that answer, and a major part of the answer, is that on the Feast of the Visitation of Mary, July 2nd, 1957, Dr. Piepkorn gave an address called Blessed Art Thou Among Women in the seminary chapel at St. Louis, and in the following year, that address was published in the Una Sancta magazine. And the address even became known in Germany. Somebody translated it into German. And Sasse alludes to this address in the article he contributed to Una Sancta in the fall of 1960 entitled The Liturgical Movement, Reformation or Revolution. Reformation or Revolution. In this essay, Sasse warns against the danger of Romanizing tendencies in general and of Dr. Piepkorn's address on the Feast of the Visitation in particular. In this article in Una Sancta, Sasse speaks of the address as, quote, the most distressing Mariological article by Professor Piepkorn, on which I have written in German, since it has appeared in Germany too. This chapel address can be found in Volume 1 of the selected writings of Arthur Karl Piepkorn. If you go online and Google Arthur Karl Piepkorn, you'll be led to the website which Dr. Philip Secker maintains of Piepkorn's writings. Secker, I was Piepkorn's last STM student. Secker was his last doctoral student, and he is determined to preserve that legacy. So back in, let's see, when was this? 1993, the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau published this collection of Piepkorn's writings in which you will find the chapel address, Blessed art thou among women. So, what about Piepkorn's address? Toward the beginning of his address, Piepkorn deplores what he calls both the excessive veneration of the Mother of God in the Roman Church and the excessive downgrading of Mary that happens in Protestantism. He notes, quote, the function of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the sacred scriptures and in the history of salvation is to point to her Son. The noblest picture that can be painted of her is with her child in her arms. He notes that in the Book of Concord, our church explicitly confesses that she is the Mother of God, the title that was given by or approved really, not given, approved by the Council of Ephesus in 431. He notes that the Book of Concord speaks of her perpetual virginity and cheerfully concedes that in the presence of God, she intercedes for the whole church on earth, and that she gave birth to the Savior without violation of her virginity. Piepkorn notes that in the carol, Behold a Branch is Growing, in the Lutheran hymnal, number 645, Mary is described as the prophetically foretold branch of loveliest form and grace. And that in the hymn Crowned with Many Crowns in the Lutheran hymnal, Mary is given the medieval title of the Mystic Rose. And that the second stanza of Ye Watchers and Ye Holy Ones is a paraphrase of the Eastern Church's Theotokion, or hymn to the Mother of God, O higher than the cherubim, more glorious than the seraphim, thou bearer of the eternal word, most gracious, magnify the Lord. Well, be all that as it may, Dr. Sasse's main objection to Piepkorn's address is that Sasse understands Piepkorn to be advocating the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, the Immaculate Conception, that in the first moment of her existence, through the merits of Christ, Mary was preserved from all taint of sin. In Piepkorn's address, he does allude both to the Immaculate Conception and the bodily Assumption as, and I quote, pious opinions long held by Christians. He cites evidence that Luther himself held that through the merits of her Son to be, Mary was marvelously preserved from sin from the first moment of her existence as a human being. That John Brent's said of the bodily assumption, about this let everyone think as he will, and that the great 17th century Lutheran preacher and hymn writer Valerius Herberger, in fact, presented a carefully reasoned case for the bodily assumption of Mary in a sermon he preached on that festival. And thanks to our good friend Matthew Carver, there is now an English translation of that sermon, and it is perfectly fascinating. So Piepkorn mentions these opinions. He points out various people in the Lutheran Church held them. But, and this I think is the crucial thing. Immediately after saying all this, Piepkorn goes on to say, and I quote, "It is when these pious opinions are elevated to the status of dogmas which must be believed under pain of eternal condemnation that we declare this kind of constraint rather than the opinions themselves to be anti-Christian and diabolical." But in a letter to Piepkorn on September 10, 1960, Piepkorn apparently had written back to him and said, "No, I'm not advocating the Immaculate Conception. I'm not advocating the bodily assumption." Piepkorn writes, Sasse writes to Piepkorn, "When you say in your letter to me that you do not accept the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, you are obliged to communicate this to the world. The hearers and readers of this devotion which you wrote would not be able to discern this, but must rather understand you to be an advocate of the Immaculate Conception." That is Sasse's take on this. So what do I think, for what it's worth? Two things are clear to me. First of all, it's clear to me that Dr. Sasse understood Piepkorn's address as advocating the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Second, that in Piepkorn's letter to Dr. Sasse, he says that he does not accept that doctrine. As one who was acquainted with Dr. Piepkorn for a decade, I can truthfully say that I never heard him express belief in the Immaculate Conception, nor in the bodily assumption of the Mother of God. So my take on it is that Sasse somehow misunderstood what Piepkorn was trying to say. That's my take on it. If you read the address, then you can make up your own mind as to what he was saying, but that is my understanding. Let me add here a footnote on the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin. And it's very interesting to note what Piepkorn had to say about this in a paper on the hermeneutics of the Lutheran confessions, which he presented to the St. Louis faculty in the same year that he gave the chapel address. It's an essay on how do you interpret the Book of Concord. Among other things, he says, he always referred to the confessions as the Lutheran symbols rather than the confessions. I'm not sure what that signifies, but he refers to them as the Lutheran symbols. Where the Lutheran symbols do not cite one or more passages of sacred scripture in support of a theological conclusion, an individual is not bound to the acceptance of such a conclusion as a doctrine. For example, if an individual does not regard Song of Solomon 4:2 Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah 66:7, Ezekiel 44:2, and Luke 1:34-35. The traditional passages cited by the church fathers, though not by the symbols, as proving the perpetual virginity of the Mother of God, with its corollary that she bore our Lord in violata virginitate et clausa utero, with unimpaired virginity and closed womb. One cannot, on the strength of the symbols, be compelled to affirm this as a doctrine strictly so called. At the same time, we cannot hereticize an individual who holds such a theological opinion as the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Sasse himself did not accept the perpetual virginity. He regarded it as an opinion grounded in medieval exegesis of Ezekiel 44, verse 2, which reads, "This gate shall remain shut. It shall not be opened, and no one shall enter through it. For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it. Therefore, it shall remain shut." That's one of the classical passages. And now I must say that I believe that Dr. Stevenson has written a very compelling study of the perpetual virginity in the Lutheran Confessions, an article called Et Tamen Virgo Mansit, and yet she remained a virgin. And dear doctor, your essay is the most convincing thing I've read on this somewhat fraught question of how the material in the Book of Concord with regard to the perpetual virginity is to be understood. So maybe when I shut up, maybe you can tell us some more about that, clarify this matter. But I agree with Dr. Stevenson. If you're curious what I think, I agree with Dr. Stevenson. Summing up, from the time of the chapel address, there is a marked change in Dr. Sasse's attitude toward Dr. Piepkorn. Whereas he had formerly been warmly appreciative, he now became highly critical, though it seems that the two men did remain on speaking terms. Pastor John Hanna recently told me that during the time Sasse was teaching as a guest lecturer at St. Louis, he often would see Sasse go to Dr. Piepkorn's office and visit with him. And I never heard Piepkorn say anything against Sasse. Never, ever. There isn't time to explore all their differences. For that, I recommend Dr. Feuerhahn's essay in the Batelko's Festschrift as a reliable account of this. But I do want to say briefly something about their difference of opinion concerning the Eucharistic prayer, which continues to be a topic of discussion among confessional Lutherans. Dr. Piepkorn was convinced that the use of a Eucharistic prayer need not contradict Lutheran doctrine in general, the doctrine of the formula of concord concerning the consecration of the sacrament in particular. And so during Piepkorn's service as a young pastor at Grace Church in Chisholm, Minnesota, he prepared a form of Eucharistic prayer which followed the order of parts in the Roman canon, but which used the language of the first Book of Common Prayer of 1549 of the Church of England, which Piepkorn, along with Luther, Reed, Henry Eister Jacobs, and others, regarded as an essentially Lutheran rite, the first prayer book, an essentially Lutheran rite. Piepkorn later prepared a shortened form which eliminated all the intercessory prayers from this so-called Schism canon. Piepkorn also had a hand in preparing the Eucharistic prayer for the joint Spanish Lutheran hymnal Culto Cristiano. And the Eucharistic prayer I used this morning is a translation of that prayer, a text which carefully removes phraseology that could be construed as contradicting Lutheran doctrine. So that was Piepkorn's view. Dr. Sasse belonged to that school of thought, and if you belong to this school of thought, please correct me if I am misrepresenting it, okay? Please correct me if I'm misrepresenting it. Dr. Sasse belonged to that school of thought which believes that any form of Eucharistic prayer that includes Christ's words of institution in it is irreconcilable with Lutheran doctrine. It is argued that when Christ's words are embedded in a prayer, they cease to be Christ's words and instead become words that we address to God. So that instead of the sacrament being pure gift, the sacrament is infected with human activity. And our Lutheran service book follows this school of thought. And so, for example, in Divine Service 1 and 2, the words of institution are rigorously separated from what is called the prayer of thanksgiving and the proclamation of Christ, which follows the words of institution. This text of these two parts around the words, the text is largely drawn from a very fine Eucharistic prayer of our German sister church. But it seems to me that the text has been pulled apart and relocated, and in at least one instance, very oddly translated. The German original of the prayer says, we give thanks for the all-sufficient sacrifice of his body and blood on the altar of the cross. We give thanks for the sacrifice. In the Lutheran service book, it reads, with repentant joy, we receive the salvation accomplished by the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. So so afraid are we of Eucharistic prayer that we can't bring ourselves to say we give thanks. We have to say, with repentant joy we receive. I'm putting forward my point of view about this. And, you know, I've prayed that Divine Service 1 and 2 right for, how long has it been now? 12 years maybe. And I always sensed it was sort of uncomfortable. And it was at a St. Michael's conference at Zion Church, Detroit, that Dr. Stevenson, I think, put his finger on it and pointed out the sort of disjointed way that whole thing works together. But there is that school of thought. There are two schools of thought on this. So Sasse held one view, Piepkorn held another view. Although Sasse and Piepkorn differed concerning the legitimacy of the Eucharistic prayer in the liturgy, I believe that both Piepkorn and Sasse were in essential agreement in their understanding of the doctrine De Scriptura Sacra, to which Dr. Stevenson alluded this morning. I've read everything in English that Sasse wrote on that, and I've read Piepkorn, and I've had him as a teacher, And I think that essentially they are in agreement. And one of the ways in which they agree is that neither of them was ever able fully to embrace what has been our synod's commonly accepted understanding, de scriptura sacra. And my own conviction is that we could benefit by revisiting what both of them had to say in this connection. But this is a very delicate and a very fraught question. It's very delicate and very fraught. But I think we can learn a great deal from both of these fathers in God. So let me conclude here. Both Sasse and Piepkorn were staunch confessional Lutherans, and both of them were, in the good sense, ecumenically minded churchmen. Piepkorn was an active participant representing our synod in the Roman Catholic Lutheran dialogue in America, and Sasse continued to participate in that dialogue later in Australia. Sasse knew and corresponded with the distinguished Roman Catholic biblical scholar Augustine Cardinal Bea, who, among other things, had been the father confessor to Pope Pius XII. Both of them were staunch confessors of the real presence in the sacrament of the altar, and both of them cherished the liturgical heritage of Christendom in general and of the Church of the Augsburg Confession in particular. Both of them demonstrated genuine pastoral concern for the Christian people. I think that perhaps the greatest difference that I see in them is the difference on the question of Lutheran unity. And I think I can fairly say that Sasse was pessimistic about the prospects for Lutheran unity, seeing the efforts toward Lutheran unity as being bogus efforts, which simply solidified the unionism typified by the Prussian Union and all that followed, culminating in the Evangelical Church of Germany in 1948. Piepkorn had a more sanguine view of the issue of Lutheran unity, and I don't know why, but I sometimes think that his experience in the military chaplaincy may have contributed to that more sanguine view. I also think, and this is crucial, one cannot exaggerate what I call the ecumenical euphoria of the 1960s, the ecumenical euphoria. I remember those days. And when John 23rd called the Vatican Council, there was just this feeling that, well, maybe now the division of the 16th century, we can resolve these problems and find the church reunited. And there was sort of a euphoria, and Sasse shared in that optimism. But then as he saw what the council did and what followed, then he realized that that concluding statement that you read out to us this morning, that Christendom was headed for a catastrophe. And my own view is I think that Sasse's estimate of the situation is the one that I find convincing. I think Dr. Piepkorn's was more sanguine than the facts of the matter justify. Well, that's my presentation.